we're now tracking a potential nor'easter that could come up the east coast and into the northeast.
This morning, El Niño's fury caught on camera. Drone footage shows a chunk of
2025 in the island's northwest. Authorities still don't know what.
The pillars, some of the best I've seen.
Something is shifting across the United States, unfolding quietly enough that many still look away. Even as the ground gives way without warning, the ocean releases what it once held, and the sky above American cities begins to change in unsettling ways. These are not distant stories or isolated incidents, but events happening across U.S., land, sea, and air, repeating with a pattern that no longer feels accidental. This video is not here to predict dates or create panic, but to place these signs together and ask what they may be revealing. If something here catches your attention, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay aware of what may come next. What collapsed did not begin collapsing that day, and that is what makes it terrifying. In parts of Florida and California, the ground gave way without warning, swallowing streets, cracking homes, and leaving behind sudden voids where stability was once assumed, even though no earthquake shook the region and no visible disaster announced its arrival. Sinkholes and landslides appeared inside quiet residential neighborhoods where life had continued normally just hours before, with no sirens, no tremors, and no dramatic buildup to signal danger. Roads that had carried daily routines split open, yards folded inward, and foundations failed in places long believed to be safe, leaving residents staring at emptiness where certainty once stood. What unsettles engineers and officials most is not the damage itself, but the absence of a clear trigger. There was no singular storm, no seismic event, no immediate cause strong enough to explain why the ground suddenly surrendered. Instead, investigations pointed downward, revealing a slower and far more disturbing truth hidden beneath the surface. For years, water had been moving quietly through limestone and soil, eroding support grain by grain, hollowing out what could not be seen, while everything above continued to appear intact. The land did not fail because it was attacked, but because it was slowly emptied from within, weakened over time by processes no one felt urgent enough to confront. This is where the fear deepens, because the surface offered reassurance right up until the moment it collapsed. Homes stood upright, streets looked ordinary, and nothing suggested that the ground beneath had already crossed a point of no return. Stability was not lost suddenly, but revealed suddenly, exposing how long danger can exist unnoticed beneath appearances. Scripture has long warned about this exact pattern, describing foundations that look firm while decay works unseen below, teaching that collapse does not begin at the moment of impact, but at the moment neglect is allowed to continue unchallenged. What fails openly has usually failed secretly first, long before anyone is willing to admit it. The imagery is difficult to ignore because it extends beyond geology into something more personal and unsettling. When foundations rot quietly, collapse becomes inevitable, not because of violence, but because of indifference, delay, and the assumption that what has always held will always continue to hold. These ground failures are not loud disasters meant to terrify, but silent warnings that something essential has been hollowed out over time. They confront us with a question that cannot be solved by engineering alone, asking whether we are standing on what only looks solid or on what has truly been reinforced. If this pattern feels familiar or unsettling, pay attention to what stands out to you. Share your thoughts in the comments and stay connected, because this may not be the last time hidden foundations are exposed. The ocean did not rage, and that is what made the scene unbearable. Along the coastline of the United States, Hundreds of orcas were discovered stranded at the same time, their massive bodies lying still where water should have been, even though no violent storm had driven them ashore and no visible disaster had torn the sea apart. These were not scattered accidents involving a few weakened animals, but entire pods arriving together, synchronized in their collapse, as if something unseen had overridden instincts refined over millions of years. The shoreline became a place of shock and disbelief, where rescuers, scientists, and onlookers struggled to understand how creatures so powerful and precise could fail in unison. What unsettled experts most was the silence before it happened. There were no seismic warnings beneath the waves, no recorded anomalies dramatic enough to explain why navigation collapsed all at once. The ocean had appeared calm, almost indifferent, right up until it released what it had always held so faithfully. Orcas are not fragile wanderers of the sea, but apex navigators capable of reading magnetic fields, sound currents, and subtle changes in water pressure with astonishing accuracy. Their survival depends on coordination, memory, and awareness far beyond most marine life, which is why their collective failure feels less like an accident and more like a rupture in something fundamental. Rescue teams rushed in, pouring water over skin that should never have felt dry, pushing against bodies heavier than vehicles, fighting time as tides refused to cooperate. Yet even as some lives were saved, the deeper question remained unanswered, because no amount of effort could explain why direction itself had failed these animals at the same moment. The discomfort deepens when explanations begin to fragment. Scientists point to possible disruptions in sonar, shifts in underwater noise, or changes in ocean chemistry, but none fully account for the scale, timing, or unity of the event. Each theory explains a piece, while the pattern itself remains intact and unresolved. Ancient writings speak of moments when the creatures of the sea disappear as order begins to unravel, not as a sentence passed down, but as a sign that balance has been disturbed at a depth beyond immediate sight. The sea does not always roar to announce change. Sometimes it withdraws in silence, releasing what it once held. What makes this event linger in the mind is not the tragedy alone, but what it suggests about systems we assume are stable. If even the most advanced navigators can lose their way without warning, then something deeper than surface conditions may be shifting beneath the waters we barely understand. These strandings do not scream destruction, but they whisper displacement, forcing us to confront the possibility that creation itself reacts when unseen thresholds are crossed. The sea may still look calm, but calm has never guaranteed order. This loss of direction leaves questions behind, and yours belongs in the comments. The cold arrived without negotiation, and it did not ask whether anyone was ready. Across the United States, a massive winter system spread outward, covering state after state with snow, ice, and air, so bitter that survival itself became uncertain, even in places long accustomed to seasonal hardship. What made this storm different was not simply the snowfall, but the way it stripped systems down to their limits. Power grids failed under relentless demand, leaving hundreds of thousands without heat for days, while frozen roads turned movement into risk and routine into danger. Communities became islands, cut off not by water, but by silence, darkness, and impassable ground. As temperatures dropped further, the consequences sharpened. Fatal accidents multiplied as vehicles lost control on glass-slick highways, emergency response slowed where access vanished, and even the structures meant to protect life began to fail. Roofs collapsed under the weight of ice and snow, and a helicopter sent to help did not return safely, reminding everyone that rescue itself was no longer guaranteed. The scale of loss was impossible to ignore. Dozens of lives were cut short, not in a single catastrophic moment, but through exposure, isolation, and systems breaking down piece by piece. The cold did not arrive explosively, yet it proved just as lethal, working steadily until endurance gave way. What unsettled authorities was how long the emergency refused to release its grip. States remained locked in crisis mode as new weather systems formed behind the first, extending the threat rather than closing it. Recovery became a moving target because relief could not begin while danger continued to advance. This kind of cold does more than damage infrastructure. It forces a confrontation with limits that technology often convinces us no longer exist, exposing how quickly modern life depends on fragile chains of power, fuel, and coordination. When those chains freeze, confidence follows them into stillness. In the language of the ancient scrolls, snow and bitter weather are not merely seasons, but commands, permitted to fall when human stride grows careless and limits are forgotten. These moments are not sent for destruction, but for restraint, forcing the earth to slow and mankind to stand still. Movement ceases, certainty thins, and the confidence of control is stripped away, leaving only exposure before forces far greater than human design. What lingers after the storm is not only damage, but awareness. The cold leaves behind a question that cannot be measured by temperature or forecasts, asking what happens when the systems we rely on are tested beyond design and patience. When survival becomes uncertain again, priorities quietly reorder themselves. This winter did not shout destruction. It pressed steadily, patiently, until everything that could not endure was exposed. The threat has not ended, and neither has the pattern begun by what came before. This feels larger than weather, and it deserves careful attention. Leave a like to help others notice what is unfolding, and stay with the video, because the next sign does not arrive from the ground or the sea. Nothing fell from the sky, and that was precisely what made it disturbing. Over parts of Texas, a perfectly circular cloud formation appeared overhead, suspended in place with a precision that felt deliberate, as light radiated outward from its center and drew attention upward without making a sound. This was not the chaos of a storm system or the spiraling violence of a tornado. The formation did not move, did not spread, and did not dissipate as weather normally does, remaining fixed in position as if anchored to a point unseen. Time passed, yet the shape held, challenging expectations about how clouds are supposed to behave. What unsettled witnesses was not fear of impact, but the absence of threat. There was no wind tearing through neighborhoods, no rain flooding streets, and no damage left behind. Yet people stopped what they were doing and stared upward, drawn by a sensation they struggled to describe. Many reported an unshakable awareness that this was not merely something to look at, but something looking back. The psychological weight of the moment lingered far longer than the image itself. Conversations stalled, phones were raised, and silence spread beneath the formation, not because anyone was told to be quiet, but because instinct demanded it. The sky, usually ignored or taken for granted, had become impossible to dismiss. Attempts to explain the phenomenon followed quickly, as they always do. Atmospheric optics, rare cloud dynamics, and unusual lighting conditions were offered as possibilities, each explanation technically plausible, yet emotionally insufficient. None of them addressed why the formation felt intentional, or why its stillness carried more impact than any violent storm. This kind of event does not destroy property or claim lives, which makes it easier to overlook, yet it reaches somewhere deeper than physical damage ever could. When the sky changes without aggression, without noise, and without urgency, it unsettles assumptions about safety far more effectively than disaster. Scripture has long described moments like this, speaking of great clouds filled with light and movement appearing in the heavens, not as instruments of destruction, but as signals of presence and warning. These images are not paired with collapse, but with awareness, marking points where attention is demanded rather than forced. The discomfort arises from what cannot be measured. A stationary formation should be harmless, yet the sensation it leaves behind suggests that visibility itself can carry weight, and that observation does not always flow in one direction. The sky does not need to strike in order to speak. What remains after the cloud fades is not debris, but memory. A moment when the ordinary order paused, when looking up felt unavoidable, and when the question was not what happened, but why it felt impossible to ignore. Moments like this are easy to explain away, and even easier to forget. But forgetting too quickly may be the real danger. Stay with the video, because what comes next does not appear in the sky, yet it presses even closer. The night itself did not change, yet everything felt redirected. Across the northern United States, tall columns of light appeared during frozen, silent evenings, rising straight upward from the horizon, as though the darkness had been given a boundary, even while the air remained calm and undisturbed. There was no storm approaching, and no sound accompanying their arrival, which made the moment feel strangely deliberate rather than accidental. The lights did not sweep across the sky or flash violently, but stood motionless for long stretches of time, holding their position as if waiting rather than passing through. What drew attention was not intensity, but alignment. These columns formed clean vertical paths that seemed to connect ground and sky, pulling eyes upward without urgency or fear. People slowed their steps, stopped their cars, and stood still, not because they felt threatened, but because movement suddenly felt out of place. Unlike dramatic celestial events that overwhelm the senses, these lights worked quietly. They lingered long enough for hesitation to set in, long enough for observers to wonder whether the moment required action or restraint. The stillness beneath them felt intentional, as though the night itself had been interrupted for observation rather than spectacle. Scientific explanations surfaced quickly, pointing to ice crystals and reflected light under rare atmospheric conditions. While these accounts explained formation, they did not dissolve the experience itself. Knowing how something appears does not always explain why it captures attention so completely, or why ignoring it feels like a choice rather than an instinct. What stayed with witnesses was not fear, but orientation. The lights did not press downward or dominate the sky, yet they drew focus upward in a way that felt purposeful. The familiar landscape below faded into the background as attention narrowed, guided quietly toward something higher without command. Old accounts describe a light rising in the night, not as a threat, but as a boundary between movement and hesitation. It did not chase or command, yet it altered the meaning of darkness itself. Those who noticed it were left with a choice: to step forward into what was revealed, or to remain where the night still felt familiar. That distinction matters, because guidance demands response. When light appears without force, it places responsibility on the observer rather than the sign itself. The night does not compel obedience. It invites awareness. When the columns faded, the darkness returned unchanged, yet the sense of direction lingered. The question was no longer what the lights were, but what it meant to notice them and choose not to look away. This moment is easy to explain and even easier to ignore. Stay with the video, because the next sign does not guide upward, but presses inward. It was not loud enough to be called noise, yet it refused to be ignored. Across parts of the southwestern United States, a dull vibration began seeping into daily life, settling into rooms, streets, and bodies like a presence that could not be located or shut off. People struggled to describe it because it did not behave like sound as they knew it. It did not rise and fall, did not echo, and did not travel from a clear direction, instead lingering as a constant pressure that felt more physical than audible, as if the air itself had thickened. The most disturbing aspect was division. Some residents stood in the same homes and heard nothing at all, while others felt the hum burrow into their skulls and chests, creating a split reality where experience could no longer be shared or verified. Conversations ended in frustration, not because answers were missing, but because perception itself had become unreliable. Over time, the effects compounded. Sleep fractured into shallow fragments, headaches arrived without pattern, and a persistent tightness in the chest made even rest feel laborious. There was no visible threat to point at, no danger to flee from, only an invisible intrusion that followed people wherever quiet should have been. Investigations moved slowly and inconclusively. Industrial sources were ruled out, geological explanations fell short, and infrastructure checks offered no resolution. Each attempt to explain the hum only confirmed one thing, that it could be measured nowhere, yet endured everywhere by those affected. This is where fear takes a different shape. When a disturbance cannot be proven, it is often dismissed, and when it is dismissed long enough, those experiencing it begin to question their own senses. The hum did not break buildings, but it eroded confidence, patience, and trust in shared reality. Scripture captures this tension through a moment of calling that was not immediately recognized, a voice that did not shout for attention, but waited to see who would listen closely enough to respond. The sound was never meant to overwhelm, but to reveal attentiveness through persistence. That parallel cuts deeply, because listening under pressure is exhausting. When the signal does not stop, ignoring it becomes deliberate, and endurance becomes a test rather than a coping mechanism. This hum does not announce disaster. It wears people down instead, quietly reshaping thought, rest, and certainty until silence itself feels unsafe. Comment, "I heard it," if this sound was familiar to you, even when others heard nothing. It began with tension people tried to explain away. Arguments escalated more quickly, patience thinned without warning, and acts of violence started appearing with a frequency that made them harder to dismiss as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of something spreading. Across communities, unrest has grown sharper, while violent crime has moved closer to daily life. What once felt distant now feels personal, and public spaces carry an undercurrent of caution that did not exist before. The sense of safety has not vanished all at once, but it no longer feels guaranteed. Division has hardened into structure. Political and ideological differences no longer function as debate, but as lines that separate identities, turning disagreement into hostility and conversation into confrontation. Language itself has shifted, with words chosen less to understand and more to provoke, deepen rifts, and assign blame. Trust has quietly deteriorated. Confidence in institutions weakens as systems appear inconsistent or self-interested, while faith in one another erodes as suspicion replaces empathy. Neighbors observe each other with distance, motives are questioned, and generosity is filtered through fear of being exploited. The fracture cuts deepest inside homes and communities. Families strain under pressure as shared values dissolve into repeated conflict, and once stable relationships splinter into silence or resentment. Communities fragment into isolated groups that no longer recognize a common bond, only shared frustration. What makes this breakdown dangerous is its familiarity. Constant tension becomes background noise, hostility becomes expected, and outrage becomes routine. When dysfunction settles into normalcy, collapse advances without resistance, because warning signs are mistaken for everyday life. This pattern was warned about long before it became visible. Jesus Christ spoke of a time when love would grow cold, not through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual erosion, as compassion retreats and patience wears thin. Moral collapse is described not as spectacle, but as temperature loss, where warmth fades until connection becomes brittle. Once internal cohesion weakens, everything else follows. External pressure feels unbearable because the inner structure meant to absorb stress has already fractured. Strength was never meant to come from force alone, but from restraint, care, and shared responsibility, all of which have thinned. This fracture is not imposed by invasion or disaster. It grows from repeated choices, normalized anger, tolerated indifference, and division rewarded until it becomes identity. By the time the damage is undeniable, repair has already become difficult. Comment, "I see it," if this breakdown feels familiar where you live, because recognizing the fracture is often the first moment it stops being invisible. These events become unsettling only when they are no longer viewed alone. One by one, each can be explained, minimized, or pushed aside. Yet when they are placed next to each other, something shifts, and the discomfort no longer comes from any single incident, but from the shape they form together. The ground weakens where stability was assumed, the sea releases what should never have left it, the climate presses past familiar limits, the sky draws attention without violence, sound intrudes where silence once lived, and human relationships fracture from the inside. Each event touches a different layer of existence, yet none of them feel disconnected once they are aligned. What they share is not chaos. They do not erupt all at once, and they do not follow the same path or timeline. Instead, they arrive unevenly, quietly, and persistently, creating a rhythm that feels deliberate rather than accidental. The absence of spectacle is what gives them weight. Patterns rarely announce themselves. They reveal their presence through repetition, through similarities in atmosphere rather than detail, and through a growing sense that coincidence is no longer sufficient as an explanation. When land, sea, sky, sound, and society all display strain, the question shifts from what is happening to why it feels synchronized. Attempts to isolate each sign provide temporary comfort. Scientific models, social theories, and political explanations each address a portion of what is unfolding. Yet none of them fully explain why these pressures appear simultaneously across unrelated systems.